Once again, happy Heritage Sunday. Happy 189th birthday to the First Presbyterian Church of Chicago. You might remember that last year we started a tradition of examining the lives of the saints of this church, one saint at a time, on Heritage Sundays. Last year it was a brilliant revolutionary named Philo Carpenter, and this week, I'm excited to share with you the life of Eliza Chappell, whose face is on your bulletin this morning. You might also know her as Eliza Chappell Porter, because she ended up marrying this church's first pastor, a young man named Jeremiah Porter. But her story begins long before she reached the shores of Lake Michigan. Eliza was born on November 5th, 1807, in a small town near the Finger Lakes in upstate New York. She was the youngest of 8 children. She was described in history written by her daughter as a bonny child, plump and fair, with curling auburn hair and bright gray eyes. Just like Priscilla, she had refugees in her family. She was a descendant of the Huguenots, who were religious refugees fleeing from persecution in France. Eliza's father died when she was young, and she went to live for a while with some cousins. Her daughter writes that she was ambitious, and she loved to play sports with her male cousins, and regularly beat them at it. When she was 14 years old, Eliza Chappell became a Presbyterian. Can I get an amen? Amen. Can I get a huzzah? Amen. When she was 16, just 2 years later, she became a teacher. 5 years after that, she opened a school for small children in Rochester, New York. Eliza would go on to start schools in almost every region of the United States, in Michigan, in Georgia, in Tennessee, in Oklahoma, in Wyoming, Texas, and right here in Chicago. I want you to take a moment to take in that fact. She started schools in 7 states, multiple schools in each state. And not only did she start those schools, but she traveled widely to recruit teachers to come to these remote frontier towns that desperately needed good education. Eliza Chappell was the original Teach for America program. She was especially passionate about educating toddlers. She once wrote, "I am more and more convinced that parents and those who have the care of children do not regard with sufficient interest the first 3 years." In this, she was about 200 years before her time. Educators and policymakers around education are just now, in the 21st century, saying that preschool is the most important time for children to be learning, and pre-K should be universal. Eliza would have been proud of the fact that this church hosted the first Head Start program in the region, and that its pastor, Art Smith, is Art with us today? Amen. Pastor Art Smith oversaw a vibrant preschool program for many years. Eliza brought her passion from New York to Michigan, where she opened a school on Mackinac Island. Her reputation quickly spread across the frontiers of Lake Michigan. Word of this ambitious young teacher reached a fledgling settlement called Fort Dearborn, which would soon become Chicago. The community at Fort Dearborn sent a delegation to consult with her about how to effectively start a school on the Chicago River. They ended up recruiting her to do it herself. One member of that delegation was a strapping young man named Jeremiah Porter, pastor of a little church called the First Presbyterian Church of Chicago. Eliza Chappell went on to establish the first public school in Chicago in 1833. She had 25 students. For comparison, Jeremiah's little church was started 3 months earlier with 26 members. Jeremiah could have no misapprehensions about being superior to Eliza just because he happened to be a man in the 19th century. He was pursuing a formidable woman, not the kind of demure woman who would be content playing first lady on Sunday mornings, but a woman who would be his partner and his equal in every way. Pastor Jeremiah had a crush on the schoolteacher, and he persuaded his crush to move her school into the First Presbyterian Church. It was the church's first space-sharing agreement, and Eliza paid $9 a month to hold her classes there. That same year, Eliza started an academy in Chicago to train teachers. And then she spent her free time with the native tribes of Western Lake Michigan, the same tribes we heard about at the top of this service, teaching their children English and doing her very best to make them Christians. But on this mission, she admits she failed. Eliza did not marry Pastor Jeremiah right away. Her life had a purpose, and she wasn't about to let some man get in the way of it. But Jeremiah finally wore her down and convinced Eliza to marry him in 1835, 2 years after they first met. Now, as you already know, Eliza would go on to establish many more schools all around the country. But this marriage was also the start of a new chapter, not just in her life, but also in her career. Because young Pastor Jeremiah was an intensely political man and an outspoken abolitionist at a time when that was a controversial point of view, even in Illinois. Eliza was radicalized by his preaching, and she became passionate about the cause. She remained devoted to racial justice for the rest of her life. She established 2 schools in Tennessee and 2 schools in Texas, specifically to serve Black children, many of whom were former slaves freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, American social studies classes might have you believe that when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, it was nothing but sunshine and rainbows for Black folks from then on. You have to remember that they were freed to a country where they were not allowed to participate in white institutions, the same institutions that they had literally built with their own calloused hands. There were virtually no Black banks or clinics or schools. So Eliza went down to the South to build some of those schools. It was a radical and a controversial thing for a white woman to do in those times. Eliza loved teaching Sunday school, especially in Black churches in the South, and the children adored her. This is a quote from her biography. Eliza would have a multitude of little Black children packed close as their little bodies would permit. I seemed to see her standing before them in that rude room upon that rough floor, her beautiful eyes beaming, her whole face illuminated with the love, while every eye was fastened upon her as she taught them about God and his laws, of Jesus and his love. Jeremiah and Eliza were both active in the Underground Railroad from the earliest days of their marriage in Chicago. Their home was the last stop for hundreds of self-emancipated people who were crossing safely into Canada. They helped organize an elaborate system of cars and vessels and boats that were waiting in Lake Michigan to help ex-slaves escape America. In his address at the 50th anniversary of this church, Pastor Jeremiah recalled meeting a Black pastor one morning who had brought his entire congregation from the South to escape together. The safest day for them to move was on Sundays because police were less active on the Sabbath. And this pastor lamented to Jeremiah that they had to leave this country, and that he looked forward to the day when they would be able to return and fight for their freedom. I want you to take a moment to take a look at the face on the cover of your worship bulletins this morning. What do we expect when we see a face like this? That is a face that I think most of us would expect to be a stern woman, a cold woman, a woman who is passionately committed to keeping the past alive at all costs, a woman who is prudish, who uses ugly words to talk about people who are different. Perhaps she looks like a woman who would disapprove of our sending a busload of ministers to the Pride Parade. On the other hand, there's a high likelihood that Eliza never knew an openly gay or transgendered person, let alone a loving and faithfully committed queer couple. Perhaps she looks like a woman who would scoff at the idea of abortion rights. On the other hand, Eliza was a mentor to many young women who followed her out west to become teachers in frontier schools. And these frontier towns were not safe places for young women. And I bet that there were many times when she was the confidant and the advocate of sisters who were trying to find solutions for unwanted pregnancies after unwanted sexual encounters. I do not know where Eliza Chappell would stand on the issues that face us with such fury today. What I do know is that Eliza Chappell was a person who loved God deeply and who loved people fiercely. Her whole motivation came from that double love. And her life shows the wisdom that one does not simply learn how to love once, but life is a continual learning of how to love better as we learn more and more about the people who we are committed to loving, the people and the God who we are devoted to love. Any couple who has been together for a long time will tell you that they learned things about their person after 10 or 20 or 30 or more years that they did not know when they first fell in love with them. And yet they are radically committed to loving every future version of their partner. This is what radical love looks like. It's a commitment to loving better as we learn more about the people we love. And this is true not only of how we love a partner or a spouse or a friend or our family, but also about how we love our neighbors as ourselves. Eliza Chappell was not born to love infants and toddlers, but she loved people and she learned to love them better. She was not born in a country that taught her to love people with darker skin than hers, but she loved people and she learned to love them better. She was not born in a world that taught her to love people with different sexual orientations and gender identities, but she loved people, and if she had lived long enough, she would have learned to love them better. And I came by this morning just to remind somebody that Eliza Chappell's legacy, the legacy that she inherited from that great Saint Priscilla, that legacy is still strong in this church. And you can see it every day, not in the uniformity of our points of view, but in the consistency of our radical commitment to love more, and to love better as we learn. Because all politics are temporary. The generations to come will cringe when they hear what we believed. but perhaps they will see us in the way that we see Eliza Chappell today, a radical spirit of love. So let us love one another as the one who knows us completely first loved us, unconditionally, recklessly, completely. Amen. Amen.